Hi, in this video we'll look at lipid metabolism. We'll look at dietary fat as it's processed throughout the body. Now the reason why that is important is because we need to know what happens to dietary fat after we consume it in order to link it to specific effects in the body. So we need to be able to track it and see where it ends up and how it can impact certain organs. So let's start out with consumption of a fatty food. Let's start out with consuming a hamburger. Now we know that hamburgers, as are many other foods, contain lots of fat. And when I say fat, I mean triglycerides and cholesterol. But let's first track the fate of dietary triglycerides. Now it all starts right there in the intestine. In the intestine, dietary fat is digested and it's processed. It is packaged into particles called chylomicrons. And these chylomicrons are very specialized particles. They're basically tiny lipid droplets that are coated with a thin layer of protein in order to be able to transport the fat throughout the bloodstream. And that's shown up here. Now these particles are produced in large quantities after a heavy meal. And what happens to them is that they're captured by an enzyme that is attached to the wall of capillaries. Shown right here, this enzyme is called lipoprotein lipase. And that enzyme is particularly important in two tissues that take up a lot of fat, either because they need it as a fuel, and that's true for muscle tissue, or because the tissue needs fat to store it as an excess energy source, and that's true for adipose tissue. Now, the lipoprotein lipase hydrolyzes those triglycerides in the chylomicron particle, and as a result, we end up with a particle that is mostly devoid of the triglycerides, and that is the chylomicron remnant particle. Now, that's what happens to the triglycerides. But let's look what happens to the cholesterol, which is also part of that hamburger. Now, that cholesterol is also incorporated into the chylomicrons, but in contrast to the triglycerides, is not dropped off in the muscle and the adipose tissue. Actually, it remains part of this chylomicron remnant particle, and it then ends up in the liver right over there. Now, this is what happens in the fat state after you've consumed a fatty meal. Now, let's look at the situation in the fasted state. Now, you can imagine in the fasted state, it is quite different because there's no more energy coming in from the diet. The energy now has to be liberated. You need to rely on your internal fat stores. So those internal fat stores are very important because they are recruited and they're broken down, and that results in the formation of fatty acids. And those fatty acids will go into the bloodstream and they can travel to other tissues, including the muscle, to be used as an energy source. But on top of that, they go to the liver right over here, and they're incorporated into triglycerides. So basically what's happening is that some of the fat shifts from being stored in your fat tissue to your liver. Now in the liver, it is not just stored, but it is also exported, and it's exported as part of a particle that we call a very low density lipoprotein. And that particle is formed right there, and it's shown up here. That particle very much resembles the chylomicron particle. It is a little bit smaller, but it has a very similar composition. It's basically a tiny lipid droplet that is surrounded by a coat of protein. So let's examine what happens to this very low density lipoprotein particle. Now, the very low density lipoprotein particle contains triglycerides, and on top of that, cholesterol, similar to the chylomicron particle. And its fate is very similar, meaning it is processed primarily through the activity of lipoprotein lipase in the adipose tissue and the muscle right over there, and it is taken up into the adipose tissue and muscle as an energy source, or to serve as a storage form of energy. Again, the particle is removed of most of its cholesterol content, and the particle that is formed is no longer called very low density lipoprotein, but low density lipoprotein right here. And that low density lipoprotein is a very important molecule, but because that molecule has been very strongly linked to heart disease. And so now you know how the low density lipoprotein is formed. It is formed from very low density lipoproteins, as most of the triglycerides are removed and the cholesterol remains part of the molecule. Now, what happens to the low density lipoprotein? it serves as a way to transport cholesterol from the liver to tissues that need it. Now, some tissues need cholesterol because they need it to incorporate it into their membranes, the cell membranes of cells in various organs. So they will take up the LDL particle. And so does the liver. It also takes up LDL. And all these organs do that via a receptor, and that's a very important receptor. It's called the LDL receptor. And it was the basis for the Nobel Prize in 1985 that was awarded to Brown and Goldstein. Now, this receptor is very important because if that receptor is defective, you're not able to properly take up LDL cholesterol and it remains in your bloodstream. And people that have that problem are at risk of premature heart disease. Now, some other people have an LDL receptor that works extremely well, and as a result, they very effectively remove that LDL from their bloodstream, and as a result, they hardly ever get heart disease. So in summary, I've told you about the fate of dietary cholesterol. We've talked about chylomicrons as the transport vehicle to get the cholesterol and the triglycerides from the intestine to the rest of the body. We've learned that in the fasted state, we have another particle that is being formed in the liver that's called very low-density lipoprotein. When that particle loses most of its triglycerides, we end up with the low-density lipoprotein particle. And the low-density lipoprotein particle we'll get back to later, but we now already know that it's a very important particle that can promote heart disease.